The hum of the bone saw, a low, persistent thrum against the thick concrete walls, was my constant companion. Here, in the quiet sanctum of my personal lab, surrounded by articulated skeletons, dusty archaeological finds, and the faint scent of preservatives, I found my clearest thoughts. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate architecture of the human frame, traced the hairline fracture on a Neolithic skull. A blunt force trauma, years ago, but the story it whispered was still legible to me. This wasn't just bone, it was a chronicle etched in calcium and collagen. My focus splintered when the secured line on my desk phone chirped, a sound as jarring as a banshee's wail in the stillness. I hesitated, my gaze lingering on the ancient injury, then reached for the receiver. Seth. My voice was gravelly, a byproduct of early mornings and late nights spent hunched over remains. Seth, it's Miller, the voice on the other end crackled. A senior investigator I'd worked with before, his tone usually clipped and precise, now carried a faint edge of something I couldn't quite place, urgency, perhaps, or a weariness that went beyond a long day. We've got a situation up at Blackwood the Guard. Alistair Finch. My hand tightened around the receiver. Dr. Alistair Finch. The name resonated with the weight of history, a celebrated historian whose recent works on forgotten legacies had stirred both academic praise and public fascination. Blackwood the Guard, too, was a name steeped in the past, an isolated estate whose very stones breathed centuries of stories. Finch? I asked, a knot forming in my gut. What about him? Found him this morning, Miller continued, his words devoid of preamble. At the base of the main tower, about 30 feet down. Appears to be an accidental fall. Local authorities are already calling it an open and shut case. Tragic, but straightforward. My mind, a restless engine, immediately rejected straightforward when paired with Finch and Blackwood. Alistair Finch was meticulous, cautious, a man who navigated ancient ruins with the reverence of a priest. A simple fall felt uncharacteristic. You want my eyes on it? I asked, already knowing the answer. That's why I'm calling you, Seth. They're ready to close it, but something's nagging at me. You know how I feel about straightforward when the subject is Alistair Finch. I understood. Miller had a nose for the subtle dissonance, and he trusted my ability to hear the silent screams of the dead. Send me the coordinates. I'll be there within the hour. The drive north was a descent into a different era. The manicured suburban sprawl gradually gave way to winding country roads, ancient hedgerows, and towering, skeletal trees that clawed at a bruised sky. Blackwood the Guard wasn't just remote, it felt deliberately cut off, a sentinel guarding its secrets. As I navigated the final stretch of gravel lane, the manor emerged from a dense copse of ancient oaks, a formidable structure of dark, weathered stone, its Gothic spires piercing the overcast heavens. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, brooding and defiant. Several official vehicles were parked haphazardly on the gravel drive, their flashing lights muted by the encroaching dusk. A uniformed officer waved me through the temporary perimeter, his face grim. I parked my SUV near a cluster of unmarked sedans and retrieved my kit from the back. Miller met me near the manor's imposing front entrance, his usually immaculate suit now rumpled, his face etched with fatigue. He gestured towards the main tower, a hulking cylindrical mass of stone that dominated the estate's profile. "He was found down there," Miller said, his voice low, indicating a section of overgrown garden at the tower's base. "Perimeters secure. They haven't moved anything, per my insistence. Just waiting for you to sign off." We walked towards the scene, our boots crunching on fallen leaves. The garden was a tangle of neglected roses and thorny bushes, punctuated by the occasional ancient stone plinth, half swallowed by ivy. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of damp soil and exposed roots. And then I saw him. He lay sprawled amidst the undergrowth, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out as if reaching for something unseen. The scene, at first glance, supported the accidental fall theory, the jagged rocks below, the height of the tower. A tragic misstep. But I didn't deal in first glances. I knelt slowly, my eyes sweeping over every detail, registering the nuances others might overlook. The first thing that struck me was the impact site. Finch's head had struck a moss-covered stone, but the pattern of blood spatter and the nature of the cranial injury seemed off. Not quite consistent with a single, direct fall from that height onto that specific rock. The deformation wasn't what I'd expect. I moved closer, my gloved hands hovering inches above the scene. The detective overseeing the initial investigation, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat. "Looks like he went over the parapet, Dr. Seth. Tragic. Slip of the foot, perhaps." I offered a non-committal grunt, my attention fixed on Finch's outstretched hand. I examined the earth. It was rich, loamy, but mixed within it, clinging to his fingernails, were tiny, almost imperceptible flakes of something else. Not stone, not wood. It shimmered faintly in the dwindling light, a deep, iridescent purple-black. It felt out of place, alien to the damp garden soil. Then I noticed the abrasion on his forearm. A thin, linear mark, not deep, but distinct. It wasn't consistent with scraping against the rough stone of the tower or the thorns of the bushes. It was too clean, too precise, almost like a burnished groove. And within that groove, barely visible to the naked eye, was another faint trace of the same purple-black particulate. My gaze drifted from the body to the immediate surroundings. The ground beneath him was disturbed, yes, but not in the chaotic manner of a body plummeting 30 feet. There were subtle indentations, almost like impressions, in the soil around him, not necessarily from him. And then, near his left foot, half buried in the mud, I saw it. A small, intricately carved fragment of what appeared to be bone or ivory. It was no larger than my thumb, aged and yellowed, depicting a stylized, archaic symbol I vaguely recognized from ancient lore, a symbol that certainly had no place in an English country garden. The detective looked at me expectantly. "Well, Dr. Seth," he prompted. I turned to him, my eyes sharp. "The scene tells a story, detective, but sometimes the first chapter is misleading. This isn't as straightforward as it seems." I paused, letting my words hang in the heavy air. "I'll need the remains transported to the military medical facility restricted autopsy section for a complete and thorough analysis. And I'll need that fragment secured." The detective's brow furrowed deeper, but he nodded slowly, recognizing the authority in my voice. A dangerous narrative, perhaps, rooted in something ancient and forgotten, now stirring beneath the surface of Blackwood the guard. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Alistair Finch hadn't just fallen. He had been pushed into a conspiracy far older than any of us could yet comprehend. It was a stark contrast to the dust-laden antiquity of the manor, yet the silence here was just as heavy, just as pregnant with unspoken stories. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, constant thrum above the stainless steel examination table, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on everything below. I peeled off my jacket, the fabric feeling too warm, too civilian in this environment, and slipped into the scrubs provided by the facility's quartermaster. The assistant, a quiet man with precise movements, had already prepped the workspace. Instruments gleamed, neatly arranged on sterile cloths. The air held the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant, trying and failing to mask the underlying scent of decay that no amount of scrubbing could truly eradicate. Dr. Finch's remains lay beneath a sheet, a muted outline of the man he once was. The detective had remained at the manor, overseeing the initial sweep, but had promised to review my findings as soon as I had something concrete. He knew, I think, that this was where the real answers would emerge. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my chest, steadying my hands. My mind replayed the scene at the manor, the impossible trajectory, the purple-black flakes, the strange abrasion, the anachronistic artifact. Each detail, a question mark hovering in the air. Now, it was time to demand answers from the most reliable witness, the body itself. With deliberate care, I drew back the sheet. Finch's face was pale, serene in death, a stark departure from the vivid, intellectual presence I glimpsed in his photographs. My gaze swept over him, noting the obvious trauma consistent with a fall, contusions, lacerations, the unnatural angles of limbs. But I wasn't looking for the obvious. I began my external examination, a methodical sweep from head to toe. My fingers, gloved in latex, moved with practiced ease, probing, feeling, assessing. The scalp, the orbits, the jawline. Everything seemed to fit the narrative of a significant impact, a fatal descent. But then, I ran my fingers along the left temporal bone, just above the ear. The skin was intact here, no visible breaks, but a subtle unevenness registered under my touch. It was minute, almost imperceptible. I reached for the hand lens, its magnification bringing the skin into sharp relief. No external damage. I made a mental note and moved on, knowing I would return to it. My focus shifted to the skeletal structure, the true repository of impact narratives. Using a specialized, non-invasive imaging device, I began scanning the bones. The device projected a detailed, three-dimensional skeletal map onto a screen beside the table, highlighting areas of stress and fracture. The initial scans confirmed the expected fractures: a shattered femur, a collapsed ribcage, a fractured skull base. All consistent with a violent, vertical impact. But as I zoomed in, adjusting the contrast and focus, I began to see it. Not gross fractures, but a spider web of microfractures, particularly concentrated around the left temporal bone and extending subtly into the occipital. These weren't the clean breaks of a primary impact. They were diffuse, almost like a series of smaller, repeated stresses. I cross-referenced the imaging data with the reported fall trajectory. A single, uncontrolled fall from the balcony, even a fatal one, would typically create a pattern of impact that could be traced. These microfractures, however, suggested a different kind of force, a localized, repeated trauma before the fall, or perhaps even a struggle. The bone structure in that specific region was compromised in a way that didn't align with the primary impact points. It was like seeing the ghost of another event, superimposed on the tragedy. My breath hitched. This was no simple accident. Next, I turned my attention to Dr. Finch's clothing, meticulously laid out on a separate sterile sheet. I'd seen the initial reports, standard attire for an evening at home. But the details were what mattered. I used a high-powered microscope, sweeping across the tweed jacket, the wool trousers, the leather shoes. Lint, fibers, dust, the microscopic universe clinging to human life. Most of it was typical: carpet fibers from the manor, traces of local pollen, human hair. Tiny, shimmering particles, like flecks of stardust, caught in the weave of the tweed. They were too uniform, too crystalline to be common dust. I carefully collected a sample with a sterile microspatula and transferred it to a slide. Under the powerful magnification, the particles resolved into distinct, angular crystals. Their color was unusual, a faint, almost iridescent blue-gray. I ran them through a preliminary spectral analysis. Comparing their unique signature against a vast database of known minerals and environmental contaminants. The results flashed on the screen, confirming my suspicion. It was a mineral dust, but one I didn't recognize from any geological surveys of the region around the manor. In fact, the database flagged it as extremely rare, associated with specific geological formations found thousands of miles away, in a remote, high-altitude desert region known for its ancient, dry riverbeds and unique mineral deposits. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled back from the microscope. The microscopic bone fractures, suggesting a pre-fall struggle or impact. The unique mineral dust, foreign to the entire continent, adhering to the victim's clothing, specifically near the head injury. It wasn't just foul play, it was orchestrated foul play, involving something or someone from far afield. The narrative was solidifying, hardening into something far more dangerous than a tragic accident. Finch hadn't simply fallen. He had been a victim, entangled in a web that stretched beyond the quiet confines of his estate, perhaps even across continents. And I, Seth, had just pulled the first threads. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight on my shoulders. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had just stepped onto a very perilous path. My breath plumed faintly in the frigid air as I leaned over the stainless steel table, my gaze fixed on the slide beneath the powerful microscope. The technician, a stoic woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, stood beside me, her expression unreadable. "We've completed the analysis of the particulate matter," she stated, her voice clipped and professional. "It's a complex matrix. Predominantly fine quartz and feldspar, consistent with typical soil erosion. But there are significant traces of something else." She adjusted a dial, bringing a minute fleck into sharper focus. It shimmered, an iridescent blue-green against the gray background. Azurite and malachite. Not unusual in themselves, often found together in copper deposits. What is unusual is the purity of these specific crystal structures, and the presence of trace elements, bismuth, tellurium, and a high concentration of silver, that narrow down the geological origin considerably. My internal gears began to turn, connecting the dots. Finch's research, his obscure papers on ancient metallurgy, the maps I'd seen scattered across his study, marked with circles near the Black Sea. Eastern Mediterranean, I murmured, more to myself than to her. Near the Black Sea coast. A very specific, ancient copper mining region. One known for a particular type of ore processing. She nodded, her lips barely curving. Precisely. We ran a comparative analysis against samples from the university's geological archives. The very name resonated with myth and antiquity, a place synonymous with hidden treasures and forgotten histories. Finch had been obsessed with the region, I remembered, his notes filled with references to obscure texts about its mining practices. The dust wasn't just dirt, it was a geological signature, a breadcrumb leading directly to a forgotten past, and potentially, to the truth of Finch's final moments. "Thank you," I said, pulling away from the microscope. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The dust was a direct link from the manor to a place thousands of miles away, a place of historical significance that had clearly become a site of current, clandestine activity. I left the sterile environment of the facility with a renewed sense of urgency. A quick search on my tablet revealed a cluster of coordinates Finch had marked in his digital files, locations he'd visited frequently in the months leading up to his death. It was the perfect cover for an unsanctioned dig. My journey was a blur of cramped flights and rattling local transport. The landscape shifted from cultivated fields to rugged, forested mountains, the air growing colder, thinner. Hours later, the hired vehicle, a sturdy, aging 4x4, struggled up a winding, unpaved track, the tires kicking up clouds of red earth. The track finally ended at a clearing, tucked away in a dense thicket of pines. It wasn't a sprawling operation, but the signs of recent activity were undeniable. Freshly disturbed earth formed mounds around a shallow, open pit. A rusted generator sat silently beside a stack of empty fuel cans. Tarpaulins, now tattered and flapping in the mountain breeze, had once covered equipment, now mostly gone. This was Finch's unsanctioned dig site, abandoned in a hurry. I knelt, sifting the damp earth through my fingers. The texture was identical to the dust I'd analyzed, the same faint metallic scent clinging to it. Someone had been here, digging for something specific, and they had left in haste. My next stop was a small, isolated village nestled in a valley further down the mountain. Finch's estranged research assistant, a young man named Elias, had been listed as his emergency contact and resided here according to a faded university record. The village was quiet. The few inhabitants I saw eyed me with suspicion. I eventually found Elias's dwelling, a modest stone house on the edge of the village, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. I knew someone would come eventually. "I'm investigating Dr. Finch's death," I stated, my voice low, my gaze unwavering. "I believe you can help me understand what he was working on, and why he ended up dead." Elias hesitated, glancing over his shoulder into the dimly lit interior of his home. He seemed torn between fear and a desperate need to unburden himself. He became obsessed, Elias began, finally stepping aside to let me in. The room was sparse, dominated by a large wooden table piled with maps and photocopied ancient texts, many of them marked with Finch's familiar scrawl. "The lost artifact." He called it that. Said it wasn't just myth, that he'd found proof of its existence. I watched him carefully, noting the tremor in his hands as he gestured. "What kind of artifact?" He wrung his hands. He was vague, almost paranoid. Spoke of it as a key, something that would unlock a forgotten chapter of history, a legacy. He believed it was hidden here, in these mountains, in one of the ancient mines. That's what we were doing, digging, but not for copper. His eyes widened, fear flashing in their depths. He started having these meetings, hushed conversations late at night. Not with academics. With others. Elias nodded vigorously, a shudder running through him. They weren't interested in history, not like Finch was. They wanted the artifact. They pressed him, threatened him. He was afraid, but also exhilarated. He thought he was close. Too close, perhaps. He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. The last time I saw him, he was leaving for the manor, muttering about a final piece of information he needed from his study. Finch had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than academic intrigue. And now, so had I. The pieces were starting to fit, forming a mosaic of greed and ancient secrets, with Finch as the tragic centerpiece. The chill Elias's words left lingered, a cold hand clamped around my resolve. Finch hadn't merely stumbled, he'd been pushed, not just into a ravine, but into a current of something far older, far more dangerous. The lost artifact, the clandestine meetings, the powerful, shadowy figures, it all coalesced into a chilling mosaic. I had to see the dig site. The drive back to the estate felt different, the familiar winding roads now imbued with a sense of quiet threat. The estate grounds, usually meticulously kept, seemed to hold their breath under the overcast sky. I navigated the service track that led to the archaeological dig, a path normally buzzing with activity, now eerily silent. The temporary fencing around the primary excavation pit hung askew in places, a sign of neglect rather than careful closure. The air was heavy with the damp scent of overturned earth and decaying leaves. What I found wasn't neglect, but a hasty, clumsy cover-up. Fresh tire tracks, distinct from the heavy machinery used for initial excavation, cut deep into the mud near the perimeter. The soil around the main trench had been recently disturbed, not by meticulous archaeological brushes, but by something broader, less precise, like a shovel or a small excavator used crudely. Several tarpaulins, meant to protect exposed sections, lay crumpled, half-heartedly draped over mounds of soil. Someone had been here, recently, and they hadn't been digging for knowledge. My gaze swept over the scene, cataloging every deviation from standard practice. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt plastic, clung to the air near a pile of discarded sandbags. Then I saw it. Tucked beneath a loose section of canvas, half buried in a fresh spoil heap, was a shard of pottery. It was small, no bigger than my thumb, but its surface was distinct. The glaze was a deep, lustrous black, adorned with an intricate pattern of swirling silver lines. I knelt, carefully brushing away the clinging dirt. This wasn't local ware. It wasn't even from the known periods of the estate's habitation. Anachronistic. Out of place. A loud, dissonant chord in a symphony of the past. Just as I carefully bagged the fragment, a patrol vehicle rumbled down the track, kicking up dust. The lead investigator, a man named Miller, emerged, his expression tight. "Seth," he began, his voice devoid of its usual casual familiarity, "I thought we agreed you'd wrapped up your findings on the Finch matter. The sheriff's office is keen to close this as an accidental fall." I stood, holding the evidence bag loosely. "My findings are ongoing, investigator. There are details that suggest otherwise." Miller's eyes flickered to the dig site, then back to me, a flash of something I couldn't quite decipher. "Details or conjecture?" "We have a clear report, a tragic accident. The family wants closure. The local authorities want closure. This isn't a murder inquiry, Seth." His tone was firm, bordering on an order. The underlying message was clear: stop digging. "I'm merely ensuring all avenues are explored, investigator. My professional obligation requires it." He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "Your professional obligation could lead to unnecessary complications. This estate has powerful connections. Let's not stir up more than we need to." He gave me a pointed look, then turned and walked back to his vehicle, leaving me with the unspoken weight of his warning. His words, combined with the strange fragment in my hand, solidified my course. I couldn't trust official channels with this. I needed to analyze this pottery shard without drawing attention, without anyone else knowing what I'd found. There was only one place I could do that discreetly, a place with the specialized equipment and controlled access required for such a delicate, potentially explosive, piece of evidence. The facility was a stark, imposing structure of reinforced concrete and tinted glass, far from the public eye. Access was granted only after multiple layers of biometric scans and security clearances, a network of silent cameras tracking every movement. I navigated to a specific subsection, a small, advanced laboratory usually reserved for highly sensitive material analysis, tucked away behind even more secured doors. I laid the pottery fragment gently on a clean, white-tiled surface. Under the high-powered stereo microscope, the intricate silver lines on the black glaze revealed themselves as impossibly fine filaments, almost hair-thin, embedded within the material. This wasn't painted, it was fused. I used a microdrill to collect a minuscule sample, then transferred it to a scanning electron microscope. The elemental analysis confirmed my suspicion. The silver wasn't just silver, it contained trace elements of rare earth metals, a composition that didn't align with any known ancient metallurgy from this region. The black glaze, too, had an unusual density and a composite structure that hinted at advanced, possibly anachronistic, firing techniques. This wasn't a simple decorative piece, it was a technological marvel, out of time, out of place. Finch had unearthed something truly extraordinary, and someone was desperate to keep it buried. The analysis took hours, each new data point deepening the mystery and ratcheting up my internal alarm. The facility was quiet as I finally packed up my equipment, the only sound the hum of the ventilation system. The weight of the fragment, now secured in a specialized container, felt heavier than its physical mass. The familiar glow of my lab's interior lights was absent. A knot tightened in my stomach. The outer door, usually sealed with a heavy magnetic lock, stood ajar. The main reception area was undisturbed, but a faint, metallic scent hung in the air. I moved slowly, methodically, through the lab. My office was a mess. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers had been pulled open and emptied, their contents scattered. My computer monitor lay face down, its screen likely cracked. Nothing of obvious value was missing: the expensive microscopes, the gas chromatograph, the mass spectrometer, they were all still there, untouched. But the message was clear. My files, my notes, my personal effects, these were the targets. Someone had been here, looking for something specific, and they hadn't found it. Or maybe, they hadn't needed to. They knew I was close. The mess was a warning, a deliberate act of intimidation. The air in the lab, usually sterile and ordered, now felt charged with a new, dangerous electricity. My hands clenched around the grip of my weapon. They wanted me to back off. But all they had done was confirm I was on the right path. The detective's words, sharp as shards of flint, echoed in my mind: unnecessary complications. Powerful connections. He'd made his position clear, a thinly veiled threat wrapped in professional courtesy. But the pottery fragment, tucked securely in a specimen bag in my kit, was a complication I couldn't ignore. Its anachronistic signature, the subtle wrongness of its glaze, gnawed at me. Finch's death, initially presented as a tragic accident, was starting to feel less like a closed case and more like a door pried ajar. I spent the rest of the evening at the estate, ostensibly reviewing my notes, but in truth, I was strategizing. The piece of pottery needed a deeper examination than I could perform in the field. There was only one facility I knew of with the advanced spectrographic and material analysis equipment I required, and access was notoriously difficult. It wasn't a place for casual visits. The air was cool, filtered, and carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone. Polished steel surfaces reflected the overhead lights, casting stark, precise beams onto rows of intricate equipment. This wasn't where bodies were typically examined, not in the traditional sense, but it housed the most advanced forensic technology in the region, a place reserved for cases of extreme sensitivity or national security. My contact, a lean, bespectacled specialist I'd collaborated with on a previous, equally unusual case, nodded a terse greeting. "You're sure about this, Seth?" the specialist asked, his voice low, matching the hushed atmosphere. He gestured towards the electron microscope and X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. "This isn't standard procedure for a ceramic shard." "I wouldn't be here if it were," I replied, placing the specimen bag on a clean, white-covered tray. "There's something off about it. A detail that doesn't fit the period it purports to represent." The specialist, whose expertise lay in microcompositional analysis, carefully extracted the fragment. Under the powerful magnification of the microscope, the fragment's surface revealed a landscape of minute imperfections and deliberate artistry. We spent hours, tracing tool marks, analyzing the clay composition, and subjecting it to various spectral tests. The firing temperature was precisely calibrated, the pigments expertly aged. Every detail screamed authenticity, yet there was that persistent whisper of anachronism. Then, the specialist pointed to a hairline crack. "Look here," he murmured, adjusting the focus. "The crystalline structure within this specific pigment. It's a modern synthetic binder." The whisper had become a shout. "And the clay?" He ran another scan. "It's an incredibly clever blend. Sourced from the correct geological region, yes, but there are trace elements, impurities. A specific type of feldspar, that suggested was processed using techniques not available until centuries later. This isn't just old pottery." He leaned back, pushing his glasses up his nose. "This is a meticulously crafted, incredibly sophisticated forgery. Designed to fool even the most rigorous examination, save for this level of analysis." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Finch wasn't merely researching ancient artifacts, he was likely investigating a high-stakes forgery ring, a network capable of producing pieces so convincing they could rewrite history and defraud collectors of fortunes. The anachronistic details I'd initially dismissed as quirks were deliberate breadcrumbs, a signature of the forger, or perhaps a clue left by Finch himself. The detective's warning about powerful connections took on a sinister new meaning. This wasn't about a simple fall anymore. This was about a threat, a cover-up. My initial assessment of Finch's death had been completely wrong. Back at the estate, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the ancient stones in hues of gold and amber. I returned to Finch's study, the room where his final research had culminated. The previous day, I had examined it with the eyes of an anthropologist, looking for clues to his academic pursuits. Now, I saw it through the lens of a criminal investigator, searching for secrets. I started methodically. The desk, which I had thoroughly searched before, received a second, more aggressive inspection. I pulled out drawers, emptying them completely, examining every joint and surface. Nothing. The study was a fortress of knowledge, but offered no obvious hidden passages. I moved to the large mahogany bookcase that dominated one wall, filled with weighty tomes on ancient civilizations. I ran my fingers along the carved molding, checking for inconsistencies. My hand brushed against a small, ornate rosette near the bottom right corner of the shelf. It felt slightly loose. I pressed it, then twisted. A soft click echoed in the quiet room. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled among a few dust-covered papers, were two items, a slim, encrypted data drive, and a rolled parchment secured with a leather strap. It was a map, hand-drawn and meticulously detailed, but unlike any geographical map I'd ever seen. It was covered in a complex array of symbols, lines, and what appeared to be ancient script intertwined with modern topographical markers. A coded map. And next to it, encrypted files. Finch hadn't just been researching forgeries, he had been actively pursuing something he needed to keep hidden, something that had cost him his life. The air in the study thickened, charged with a new, dangerous tension. I had found the heart of the conspiracy. The air here was perpetually cool, sterile, tasting faintly of ozone and industrial cleaner. Stainless steel gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the focused intensity one brought to my work. This wasn't a place for the living, but for dissecting the past, for stripping away the layers of a story until only the undeniable facts remained. And Finch's story, I now understood, was far more intricate than a simple tragic fall. I had commandeered one of the examination tables, not for remains, but for my mobile forensics workstation. Cables snaked across the metal, connecting Finch's secure drive to my array of specialized hardware. The drive, a deceptively innocuous black rectangle, hummed softly as my decryption algorithms gnawed at its defenses. The anachronistic details I'd found on the estate, the peculiar bone structures, the subtle discrepancies in the historical texts, they weren't isolated anomalies. They were fragments of a larger, meticulously constructed deception. Finch wasn't merely researching ancient artifacts, he was likely investigating a high-stakes forgery ring, a network capable of producing pieces so convincing they could rewrite history and defraud collectors of fortunes. My gut tightened. This was no longer just about a suspicious death, it was about the integrity of the past itself. Hours blurred into a singular, grinding focus. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a rhythm of commands and adjustments. The initial layers of encryption were robust, designed to frustrate and deter, but they weren't insurmountable. I employed a multi-vector attack, combining brute force techniques with pattern recognition algorithms honed over years of untangling digital knots. The screen flickered with streams of hexadecimal code, then lines of seemingly random characters. My eyes, trained to spot the smallest anomaly, scanned for the telltale signs of a key, a hidden marker, anything that would give me purchase. Then, a breakthrough. A small block of text, initially disguised as system files, yielded to a custom cipher I developed years ago. The screen changed, displaying a partial, heavily coded map. It wasn't geographical in the traditional sense, but a network diagram, a spider web of nodes and connections that hinted at locations across continents, interspersed with cryptic symbols and alphanumeric strings. I cross-referenced the symbols with Finch's research notes, which I'd meticulously digitized. One cluster of symbols corresponded to known sites of illicit digs, others to private collections notoriously guarded from public scrutiny. As the coded map began to yield its secrets, the encrypted files started to break. The first legible document that emerged wasn't a financial ledger or a list of names, but a philosophical treatise, almost a manifesto. It spoke of the legacy, not as a collection of objects, but as a continuity of power, a thread stretching back through forgotten centuries. It detailed methods for preserving this legacy through the strategic placement of artifacts, both genuine and fabricated, into historical narratives. Gods above, I murmured, the words feeling hollow in the sterile room. This wasn't merely about profit. It was about control. Further decryption revealed more. The file spoke of the Keepers, a clandestine group dedicated to upholding the legacy. They were described as guardians of obscured truths, individuals who understood that history wasn't just written, but curated. Their network, as the partially decoded map now showed, was far more extensive than I'd initially imagined, reaching into academic institutions, auction houses, and private circles of immense wealth. These weren't petty criminals, they were architects of perception, manipulating the flow of information on a global scale. One file, labeled protocols_vesp.dat, detailed the process of historical augmentation. It described how genuine artifacts, priceless and often uncatalogued, were moved to bolster fabricated narratives supported by expertly crafted forgeries. These forgeries, the document chillingly explained, were not merely replicas but narrative anchors, designed to subtly shift understanding, to validate specific interpretations of the past that served the Keeper's agenda. My fingers paused, hovering over the keyboard. Finch had been on the verge of exposing something monumental, something that threatened the very foundations of historical scholarship. The anachronistic details I'd found, the peculiar enamel on the unearthed vase, the microscopic tool marks on the alleged Roman coin. The subtle variations in isotopic ratios in the bones, they were all proof of this historical augmentation. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate. Sophisticated lies woven into the fabric of time. The tension in the room was palpable, a growing pressure behind my eyes. The implications were staggering. If the keepers could rewrite history, what else could they control? What truths had they buried? And what would they do to protect their meticulously constructed reality from someone like Finch, or from me? It had been a jarring transition from the quiet elegance of Finch's study, but the starkness here sharpened my focus. The initial shock of the revelation, that Finch's death was no accident, had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I stood over the stainless steel table, the harsh overhead lights reflecting off its polished surface, illuminating the fragments I had meticulously collected from Finch's clothes and the scene itself. My gloved fingers sorted through the microscopic samples. The anachronistic mineral dust. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but my training had taught me to see the world in layers of particulate matter. Under the high-powered microscope, the dust revealed itself as an intricate crystalline structure, unlike anything commonly found in the region around Finch's estate. I'd run initial spectral analyses, cross-referencing against geological databases, but the results had been inconclusive, hinting at a rare, perhaps even unique, composition. It was a signature, I was certain, of a very specific place. I remembered a conversation with Finch months ago, a casual mention of a retired curator, a former mentor of his from his early academic days. The curator, a man known for his encyclopedic knowledge of obscure archaeological sites and private collections, had supposedly retreated from public life years ago, disillusioned by the commercialization of history. If anyone could identify such a specific mineral signature, or at least point me towards its likely origin, it would be him. Finch had always spoken of him with reverence, tinged with a slight melancholy, as if the curator carried a burden too heavy to share. Tracking down the retired curator was a task that required more finesse than brute force. He'd vanished from academic circles, his last known address a dusty entry in an old university directory. Eventually, a former colleague, now teaching at a small provincial university, remembered a cryptic postcard from years ago, bearing an address in a quiet coastal town, far from any major research institution. The journey took me inland, away from the facility's sterile confines, through winding country roads bordered by ancient stone walls. The coastal town was quaint, sleepy, smelling of salt and damp earth. I found the address, a small, weathered cottage tucked behind a tangle of rose bushes, overlooking a restless gray sea. A faint light glowed in a window. I knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet evening. After a long moment, the door creaked open a fraction, revealing a sliver of face, framed by a shock of white hair and deep-set, weary eyes. The retired curator. He looked older than the photographs I'd seen, his skin like parchment, but his gaze was sharp, wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy, laced with an old-world formality. My name is Seth, I said, showing him my professional identification. I was a colleague of Dr. Finch. I need to speak with you about him. It's urgent. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. He hesitated, then sighed, opening the door wider. The interior was a cavern of books, stacked floor to ceiling, their spines a riot of faded colors. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. He led me to a small, cluttered sitting room. Finch was a good man, the curator said, waving me towards a worn armchair. Too good, perhaps, for this world. He was murdered, I stated, watching his reaction. The words hung heavy in the air. The curator flinched, a tremor running through his thin frame. He sank into a chair opposite me, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the small fireplace. I feared as much, he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackle of wood. He was getting too close. Close to what? I pressed, leaning forward. He was investigating something, wasn't he? Something beyond his published work. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He spoke of an organization, a society. He called them the Keepers. The Keepers? I repeated, the name echoing with an almost mythical weight. They believe they are the true custodians of history, the curator explained, his voice gaining a weary strength. Not just preserving it, but controlling it. Controlling access to it. They operate in the shadows, manipulating archaeological finds, shaping narratives, all for political and financial leverage. They deem certain discoveries too dangerous, too disruptive, for public knowledge. Finch found something, didn't he? Something they wanted to suppress. The curator nodded slowly. He alluded to a discovery, an artifact or a site, that could rewrite significant portions of established history. Something that threatened their carefully constructed version of the past. He paused, then looked directly at me. He mentioned a unique mineral signature. A specific type of crystalline dust he'd found at a preliminary site. He was trying to trace its origin. I pulled a small, sealed vial from my pocket, containing a minute sample of the dust I'd collected. Is this what he meant? I asked, placing it on the small table between us. The curator picked up the vial, holding it to the light from the fireplace. His eyes, though old, were still incredibly sharp. He rotated it slowly. This. Finch described it to me. He believed it came from a very specific geological formation. A private estate, remote and almost entirely inaccessible, deep in the Scottish Highlands. The Macpherson estate. It's been in the same family for centuries, guarded by an almost fanatical obsession with privacy. I remembered Finch's travel diary, a fleeting entry about a proposed research trip to a site of forgotten significance in the Highlands, marked with a cryptic symbol. My forensic analysis, combined with the curator's testimony, had just drawn a direct line from Finch's death to a specific, remote location. The curator's hand trembled slightly as he set the vial back down. Finch believed that estate was more than just a private holding. He thought it was a stronghold. A central vault for the keepers. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying finality. Finch hadn't just stumbled upon an artifact, he had uncovered the very heart of their operation. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken dangers. I now had a name, a motive, and a target. My investigation had just escalated from a puzzle to a very real hunt. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was now firmly in the keeper's crosshairs. I wasn't here for another victim, not directly. I was here for a microscopic ghost, a final, overlooked whisper from Finch himself. A junior technician, a young man with nervous eyes and perpetually sanitized hands, stood by, ready to assist. Everything is prepared, Professor, he murmured, indicating the powerful electron microscope and the meticulously labeled slides beside it. Thank you, I replied, my voice a low rumble. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. Most of it was common garden soil, unremarkable. But one sample, a mere speck no larger than a grain of sand, had caught my eye in the original evidence photos. Its color, an unusual shade of deep ochre, hinted at something more. I carefully placed the slide under the lens, adjusting the focus with practiced precision. The image resolved into a jagged landscape of crystalline structures, alien and beautiful in their magnification. This wasn't ordinary dirt. I recognized the distinctive lamellar habit and the deep, rich coloration. It was cinnabar, a mercury sulfide mineral, often found in ancient mining sites, prized for its vibrant red pigment. Finch had been an expert in Roman history, specializing in obscure provincial trade routes in mining. Operations. Finch hadn't just stumbled onto a forgery, he'd likely discovered where Thorne sourced his pigments, and perhaps, the very raw materials for his illicit trade. This wasn't just a forgery ring, it was an entire ecosystem of archaeological plunder, from the earth to the auction house. The cinnabar, with its unique isotopic signature, was a breadcrumb leading directly to Thorne's estate. Professor, the technician prompted, sensing my prolonged silence. This is it, I confirmed, my voice taut with revelation. Pack these slides for transport. Secure them personally. The technician nodded, his expression shifting from nervousness to a bewildered understanding of the gravity in my tone. I had my final piece of the puzzle, the forensic signature that linked Finch's death to Thorne's operation. The time for subtle investigation was over. It was time to go to the source. The drive to Thorne's estate was long, winding through forgotten backroads that grew progressively narrower and more overgrown. The landscape shifted from cultivated fields to dense, ancient forest, the trees pressing in on the asphalt like silent sentinels. Thorne's property was immense, enclosed by a formidable stone wall topped with gleaming razor wire and discreetly placed cameras that glinted in the late afternoon sun. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, a clear indication Thorne had something significant to protect. I parked my unassuming rental car several miles away, tucked deep within a thicket of pines, and proceeded on foot. The air grew cooler as dusk approached, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My bag, heavy with a few essential tools and my camera, felt like a part of me. Bypassing the main gate was out of the question. I circled the perimeter, searching for a weak point, a blind spot in the omnipresent surveillance grid. High-definition cameras watched every angle, but I spotted a slight anomaly, a section of the wall where an ancient oak had grown too close, its gnarled branches offering a precarious path over the wire. It was a risk, but a calculated one. Climbing was a silent, gritty affair. Bark scraped against my jacket, and the razor wire hummed with latent electricity as I carefully navigated around it. I knew better than to approach it directly. My target was not Thorn himself, but the secrets he kept hidden. I moved along the perimeter of the main building, my eyes scanning for service entrances, ventilation shafts, anything that suggested a hidden annex or a basement. A faint, metallic tang, almost imperceptible, drifted from a low-slung building set slightly apart from the main house. It wasn't the smell of domestic cleaning products or cooking. It was the scent of chemicals, solvents, and something else, ancient earth, dry and mineral-rich. Bingo! The building was heavily secured, its windows barred, its single steel door thick and reinforced. I produced a small, specialized toolkit from my bag, working with quiet, deliberate movements. The lock mechanism was complex, but I had encountered similar designs in other clandestine operations. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me, plunging the space into near-total blackness. A tiny penlight flickered to life in my hand, its beam cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the smells I'd identified, acetone, resins, clay, and that distinct, earthy scent of ancient materials. This was it. The beam swept across the room, revealing a sophisticated setup. Workbenches lined with precision tools, microscopes, and specialized ovens. Vials of rare pigments, some clearly derived from cinnabar, were neatly arranged. Partially finished artifacts lay strewn about, an ancient-looking ceramic shard with a fresh break, a metallic figurine waiting for its patina, a scroll undergoing a process of artificial aging. It was a state-of-the-art forgery workshop, a testament to Thorne's meticulous, criminal enterprise. The scale was breathtaking, the craftsmanship alarming. These weren't crude fakes, they were masterpieces of deception. My gaze settled on a large, reinforced door at the far end of the workshop, distinct from the others. It hummed faintly, a low thrum of concealed machinery. A vault. My hunch intensified. I approached, examining the security panel. It was biometric, requiring a palm print and a retinal scan. Too advanced for my tools. But then, my eyes caught a faint, almost invisible seam in the wall beside the vault door, partially obscured by a stack of ancient-looking crates. It wasn't a crack, it was a hidden panel. Thorne had a backup, a hidden access point, perhaps for his trusted master forger. The passage led to a smaller, secondary vault, less ostentatious than the main one, but no less secure. This one, however, relied on an older, mechanical lock. My fingers danced over the tumblers, listening for the subtle clicks. Moments later, the heavy steel door swung inward, revealing a treasure trove that stole my breath. Inside, bathed in the beam of my penlight, was not just a collection, but a meticulously organized repository of genuine, priceless artifacts. Golden death masks, intricately carved jade figures, papyrus scrolls preserved in climate-controlled cases, obsidian blades, and ceramic amphorae still crusted with centuries of seabed sediment. These weren't fakes, they were the real deal, clearly plundered from archaeological sites across the globe. I recognized a rare Cycladic idol, its stark, elegant form unmistakable. Thorn hadn't just commissioned forgeries, he was hoarding the actual history he claimed to protect, trafficking in stolen heritage under the guise of an art collector. A sudden, piercing alarm shrieked through the quiet. A red light flashed, pulsing erratically. My presence had been detected. Thorn's advanced security systems, even with my cautious movements, had finally caught me. The walls seemed to vibrate with the urgency of the alarm. Footsteps pounded from above, growing closer. I had mere seconds. I slammed the vault door shut, the clang echoing like a death knell. Retreating through the hidden passage, I burst back into the forgery workshop, the red lights painting everything in a frantic, bloody hue. The main door I had entered through was now glowing, a faint outline of power suggesting it was being locked down. I scanned the workshop frantically. A large ventilation shaft, usually too small for a man, seemed my only option. I scrambled onto a workbench, kicking aside tools and half-finished fakes, and forced my way into the shaft, the metal groaning under my weight. The space was tight, claustrophobic, but it led somewhere. I heard shouts, the crashing of the main door being forced open. They were in the workshop. I crawled, pushing through dust and debris, the sounds of the search growing louder behind me. The shaft angled upwards, then downwards, finally opening into a dense thicket just outside the building's perimeter. The alarm still blared, but it was receding, swallowed by the vastness of Thorn's estate. I was out, but the escape had been too close. I had found what I sought, a mountain of evidence confirming a conspiracy far grander and more insidious than I had imagined. Thorn wasn't just a collector, he was a pirate king, and I had just landed on his treasure island. The game had just shifted. It was no longer about proving a single murder, it was about exposing an empire. And Thorn, I knew, would be coming for me. But I wasn't at a table. I was hunched over a workstation, a digital microscope feeding magnified images onto a large monitor, surrounded by a blizzard of printed photographs, evidence bags, and my meticulously organized notes. Hours had blurred into a single, relentless pursuit of clarity. My gaze flickered between a microscopic image of a single, unusually robust fiber, almost a thread, taken from a tear in Finch's trousers, and a high-resolution photograph of an antique tapestry I'd meticulously documented in one of Thorn's less frequented storage rooms. The color was an exact match, a deep, almost forgotten shade of indigo. The weave pattern, under magnification, was identical. It wasn't a common fiber, not in this day and age. It was a fragment of the past, clinging to Finch's modern clothing. This wasn't incidental contact, it spoke of a struggle, a deliberate transfer. I clicked through a series of images, pulling up close-ups of the small, almost imperceptible abrasions on Finch's forearms, consistent with being dragged over a rough, woven surface. Then, I overlaid them with the texture analysis from the tapestry. The patterns aligned with chilling precision. This wasn't a tragic fall. This was an altercation, a struggle, and the tapestry was a silent witness. Next, I focused on the soil samples. It was a distinct mineral composition I'd noted from a disturbed patch near an overgrown, forgotten gate. This was not where Finch was found. He had been somewhere else first. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing my findings with the structural integrity reports of the estate, the geological surveys, even the historical maps I'd managed to unearth. Every piece of data I collected, every minute detail, began to coalesce into a damning narrative. The initial scene of Finch's demise had been carefully staged. The true scene, the place of the actual struggle, was elsewhere on Thorne's property. Then came the artifacts. The fragmented pottery shards, the peculiar metal residue found embedded in the wood of the balustrade near Finch's body, the unusual mineral deposits on the stone steps. They weren't just old, they were ancient, bearing symbols I'd now identified as belonging to a specific, obscure cult from a forgotten pre-Roman civilization, the very cult Finch had been investigating, the very cult whose artifacts Thorne was known to illicitly trade. I pulled up images of Thorne's private collection, zooming in on the intricate carvings of a ceremonial dagger. The patterns matched. The symbols were identical. The pieces clicked into place with an unnerving finality. Thorne wasn't just a collector, he was a perpetrator, deeply entrenched in the illicit trade of these ancient relics, and Finch's investigation had brought him too close to the flame. The Keeper's conspiracy, once a whisper, a hypothesis, now materialized as a stark, tangible network, its tendrils reaching into the very fabric of Thorne's life and the estate itself. My internal clock screamed at me. The evidence was irrefutable, but its presentation needed to be equally unassailable. I began compiling my digital presentation, each slide a precise articulation of fact, each photograph meticulously annotated. I knew the local constabulary had initially dismissed the death as an accident. Now, I had to assume that some within their ranks might be unwilling, or even actively hostile, to the truth I was about to reveal. My life, I realized, was now gravely at risk. I was no longer just an anthropologist, I was a threat to a powerful, hidden order. The knowledge I held was dangerous, capable of dismantling not just one man's reputation, but an entire illicit network. I ran a hand over my tired eyes, the hum of the fluorescent lights a constant drone. This wasn't just about Finch anymore. It was about the integrity of history, about justice, and about my own survival. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for confrontation was upon me. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic, a familiar tang that usually meant answers were close. I leaned over the digital microscope, my eye pressed to the eyepiece, scrutinizing the minute striations on a fragment of bone. The fracture pattern wasn't consistent with a simple fall. The impact points, the angular displacement, they told a story of directed force, not accidental momentum. I had spent the last 2 days meticulously re-examining every scan, every tissue sample, every microscopic fiber recovered from the historian's remains. The initial report, a rushed formality from a local examiner, had been a whitewash, a convenient narrative for a powerful man. But the truth, as always, was in the details. The anachronistic pollen grains, caught in the weave of the historian's tweed jacket, didn't belong to the estate's indigenous flora. They were from a species native to a distant, arid region known for its ancient ruins, a region linked to the very artifacts the historian had been researching. And the faint residue, almost invisible to the naked eye, a dark, crystalline substance clinging to a microfracture on the historian's skull, proved to be a rare mineral, historically used in ritualistic carvings from that same ancient civilization. It was too specific, too damning to be coincidence. Someone had struck him, likely with an object made or coated with this very material. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just about a tragic fall. This was about a deliberate act, masked by an orchestrated lie, all to protect a hidden cache of illicit antiquities. The historian had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have, and the keepers had silenced him. The estate owner, a man whose reputation was built on his patronage of history and art, was at the heart of it. He was the principal, the collector, the one who profited. I pulled back from the microscope, rubbing my tired eyes. The evidence was irrefutable. It was time to stop gathering and start confronting. I couldn't go through official channels without risking the evidence being buried, or worse, my own involvement being minimized. The estate owner's influence ran deep. No, this had to be direct. I made the call from a secure line within the facility. "This is Seth," I stated, my voice steady. "I need to speak with the estate owner. I've uncovered some additional findings regarding the historian's accident that I believe he'll want to review personally. Immediately." I let a hint of professional urgency color my tone, implying something new but not overtly threatening. The estate owner's assistant, after a brief, tense pause, confirmed a meeting for that evening at the manor. The drive back to the estate felt different. The winding country lanes, once picturesque, now seemed to coil like a snare. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, felt heavy with unspoken secrets. I entered the grand foyer, the polished marble reflecting the glow of the chandeliers like dark water. A hushed quiet hung in the air, broken only by the soft click of my shoes. The estate owner awaited me in his study, a cavernous room lined with ancient tomes and display cases filled with artifacts, some I now knew were likely ill-gotten. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes sharp and unreadable above a carefully trimmed beard. "Professor Seth," he greeted, his voice smooth, devoid of warmth. "I confess I'm surprised by your return. I understood your work was concluded." "My work is never truly concluded until the truth is unequivocally established," I replied, stepping further into the room. I carried a slim, leather-bound portfolio, not a briefcase, to project an air of scholarly presentation rather than legal accusation. "And in this case, the truth is far more complex than initially reported." I placed the portfolio on the corner of his desk, opening it to reveal high-resolution photographs, the pollen grains, the mineral residue, the detailed fracture patterns on the bone. I laid them out one by one, my voice calm, factual, dissecting the narrative of a fall, piece by meticulous piece. The historian was not alone when he fell. And his fall was not accidental. These details, I gestured to the images, point to a struggle, a deliberate act of violence. The anachronistic pollen and the rare mineral residue, sourced from the very region of the artifacts he was investigating, linked directly to your collection, and more specifically, to the keeper's operation. The estate owner's composure fractured. His hand tightened around his glass, knuckles white. "And my collection is entirely legitimate." "Is it?" I challenged, my gaze unwavering. "Or is it the repository for a network that traffics in stolen history, willing to eliminate anyone who threatens its secrecy?" The historian found something here, something that proved your involvement, and he paid the ultimate price. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. The smooth facade had evaporated, replaced by a predatory stillness. "You've made a grave error, Professor," he said, his voice a low growl. "Digging where you don't belong." "I dig for the truth," I countered, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy antique letter opener I'd subtly pocketed from the foyer table. "A small, anachronistic detail of my own, a last-minute insurance policy. And I have found it." The estate owner lunged, not for me, but for the portfolio, his intent clearly to destroy the evidence. I reacted instantly, sweeping the portfolio off the desk and out of his reach. He snarled, a sound utterly devoid of humanity, and came for me then, a heavy bronze statue of a mythological beast suddenly in his hand. The air crackled with menace. The scholarly debate was over. This was a fight for survival. I ducked under his wild swing, the heavy statue whistling past my ear. The man was stronger, larger, but I had agility and the intimate knowledge of the scene of the crime. I knew the manor's layout, its hidden nooks, its treacherous turns. This wasn't just about exposing him, it was about getting out alive. I sprinted, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the silent halls, the estate owner's heavy tread close behind. The chase was on, through the dimly lit corridors, past tapestries that seemed to watch with ancient eyes, toward the very place where the historian had met his end. I needed to lead his back to the scene, back to the details he tried to bury, back to the truth. I didn't reply. I could hear his labored breathing, a rasping sound that spoke of age and desperation, but his pace was relentless. He knew these passages, every twist and turn, every shadowed alcove. I burst into the great hall, the vast space now illuminated by the faint glow of dawn seeping through the high arched windows. The grand staircase, a spiral of polished wood and wrought iron, loomed before me. The very spot where the historian's body had lain was still etched in my memory. The estate owner was already there, not fleeing. Standing defiantly at the base of the staircase, a small, antique pistol clutched in his trembling hand. "You won't expose us," he hissed, his voice thin, reedy, laced with an ancient venom. "The legacy must be protected." "The legacy of murder and theft?" I countered, slowing my pace but keeping my eyes fixed on the weapon. "That's not protection. It's desecration." A flicker of something, fear? Despair? Crossed his face before hardening into resolve. He raised the pistol, the barrel wavering slightly. My mind raced, calculating the distance, the angle, the risk. This wasn't about an ancient artifact anymore, it was about survival. Just then, a sharp whistle pierced the air from behind me. The detective, followed by a tactical unit, flooded into the hall. The estate owner's eyes widened, his gaze darting wildly between me and the new arrivals. His shoulders slumped, the pistol dropping from his grasp with a dull clatter on the marble floor. The game was over. The ensuing days were a whirlwind. The estate, once a silent monument to history, became a hive of activity. Forensic teams meticulously combed every inch, uncovering hidden chambers and secret passages that had housed not only the stolen artifacts but also the meticulous records of the keepers, a network far more extensive than I had initially imagined. Their dark legacy, built on centuries of illicit trade and the suppression of inconvenient truths, was laid bare. The stolen artifacts, a breathtaking collection of pieces that should have been in museums, were carefully catalogued and prepared for repatriation. Each fragment, each scroll, each jewel told a story of its own, a silent testament to the historian's sacrifice and my relentless pursuit. The estate owner, along with several high-ranking colleagues implicated in the network, were taken into custody. The initial reports indicated a confession, a desperate unraveling of a conspiracy that had been kept under wraps for generations. The remains of the historian lay before me, carefully re-examined. The official cause of death, initially a tragic fall, was now definitively reclassified as murder. My earlier observations, the subtle bruising patterns, the minute anachronistic fibers, the precise angle of impact, were confirmed by the extended investigation. The truth, meticulously pieced together through the language of bone and tissue, was undeniable. The relief was immense, a deep exhale after weeks of holding my breath, but it was tempered by a pervasive weariness. This case had burrowed deep, leaving its mark not just on my professional record, but on my psyche. I found myself staring at a small, almost imperceptible chip on one of the historian's vertebrae, a detail I had noted during my initial examination. It was a tiny piece of the puzzle, yet it had been enough. Enough to unravel a conspiracy, enough to bring a measure of justice. My science had spoken, and the world had listened. The pursuit of truth, I reflected, was rarely clean or simple. It was messy, dangerous, and often came at a cost. It solidified my conviction that the silent narratives held within the earth and within human remains were worth every risk. The air tasted different now, sharper. This case had changed me. The meticulous, analytical work I loved was no longer enough. Perhaps, I mused, a new chapter was beginning for me, one where the pursuit of justice would demand more than just analysis. It would demand a more active, perhaps even dangerous, role in bringing the hidden to light. The bones had spoken, and I had listened.